He's a postdoctoral researcher at the Berlin Brandenburgische Akademie der Wissenschaften, and he will present on extracting, rephrasing, expanding Paul in Byzantium. Gregory Alan 605, Arethas of Caesarea, and the abridged version.
So the main purpose of this presentation is to present some results of my doctoral thesis at the University of Birmingham on the manuscript tradition of the Pseudo-Oecumenian Catena on Romance. In particular, I will illustrate a newly identified category of manuscripts that were either overlooked by previous scholarship or assigned to the wrong category of witnesses. These manuscripts transmit an abbreviated version of the normal typus of the Pseudo-Oecumenian Catena, as I will be demonstrated in the selected passages I will discuss later with you today. Okay, it's a PDF I have to. Yes, I think it works. Yeah, thank you. So, my investigation on the manuscript tradition of this catena type has revealed significant parallels between the exegetical content of the so-called abridged version group and the first row of scholia in the manuscript Parisius Grecus 216, Gregorian 605, a multi-layered catena on the Praxapostolos described by Alessia Adriana Letta as one of the most relevant manuscripts from the end of the 9th and the beginning of the 10th century. In addition to analyzing the stratified textual layers of this manuscript, the present study advances new hypotheses concerning its potential connections with the scriptorium associated with Arethas of Caesarea. These propositions build on a recent article by Pirtea on the paratextual material of the commentaries on the Apocalypse, with a particular attention to the role of Gregory Allen 314, a witness of the abridged version for the Pauline Epistles, considered as a neo-prototype for the integration of the Apocalypse commentaries in New Testament manuscripts throughout the 10th and 11th centuries. The 8 manuscripts of the abridged version are part of a broader manuscript tradition encompassing 85 witnesses. The designation Pseudo-Oecumenian was first introduced by Karl Stab in his seminal study of the Pauline Epistles, published in 1926, and reflects the presence of scholia attributed to Ecumenius among the so-called Corpus Extravagantium, a collection of excerpts drawn from various patristic homilies and commentaries on Romance and transmitted in the Catena tradition either anonymously or with explicit attributions. Based on the inclusion of this additional layer of material, an initial category of manuscripts, known as Stab's normal typus, has been identified as transmitting the unattested Ur-Catena, namely the archetype of the tradition containing the lethal stage of 908 number extracts, along with the Corpus Extravagantium, consisting of 134 extracts mainly from Chrysostom, Theodoret, Cyril, Basil, and, of course, Oecumenius. A subsequent textual layer, known as Scholia Phociana, includes 178 extracts from the lost commentary by Photius of Constantinople on the Pauline Epistles, alongside the material from the normal typus, and this is the so-called Herbertite typus or expanded type. The manuscript that I selected for coming critical edition of the Pseudo-Oecumenian Catena is a representative of this expanded type, and is the Marchanus Grecus 33, Gregorian 1923. In this case, there is a typical example of frame catena with the biblical text in the middle and the older scholia all around. So we have the number comments preceded by numbers, of course, the Corpus Extravagantium, which includes the access from the Church Fathers with symbols or sometimes with the name of the authors, and the Scholia Phociana, usually preceded by the siglum for Photium in an abbreviated form, and sometimes also with the repetition of the biblical lemmata. Additionally, 2 shorter versions of the normal typus have been identified. One transmits only a small selection of scholia from the Corpus Extravagantium, while the other preserves a previously unidentified epitomized version of the catena of the normal typus, the abridged version 1. Also, sub-identified 2 more types, the so-called special typus, which has been excluded from my investigation as it appears to be a single hybrid manuscript resulting from the conflation of 3 distinct stages of the textual tradition, namely the normal typus, the expanded type, and the so-called secondary expanded type. And this latter stage as well has not been included since Teodora Panella has already demonstrated that this group represents a complex Constantinopolitan catena separated from the rest of the Pseudo-Oecumenian manuscripts, and attesting to a secondary catena tradition that combines material from multiple sources, either within or without the Pseudo-Oecumenian tradition. So, as the original aim of this research was to produce the first ever critical edition of the Pseudo-Oecumenian Catena, out of the 85 witnesses of the tradition, I transcribed in full 8 manuscripts selected as a representative of each of the types. These transcriptions, thanks to Hugh Houghton and Catherine Smith, have been converted into XML and online, published online, both in the form of transcription of the single manuscripts and a synopsis of the 3 different classes of scholia. So, synopsis of the number scholia, synopsis of the corpus extravagantium, and synopsis of the scholia forzonia throughout all the manuscripts that we selected for a future critical edition of this type of the catena. Next, okay, I do. Okay, so these are the 8 manuscripts from the abridged version group. As I said before, these manuscripts have been misclassified by the previous scholarship. These have been usually grouped under stabs type E, which include manuscripts transmitting the isolated scholia from the Pseudo-Oecumenian tradition, typically the extravagantes of the normal typus, sometimes supplemented with additional material from other sources, in particular John Chrysostom. However, these 8 manuscripts listed in the slide diverge from that pattern. Rather than presenting fragmentary glosses, they transmit the text of the Pseudo-Oecumenian Catena of the normal typus, comprising number extracts and the corpus extravagantium, but in an abbreviated form. The manuscript selected as a representative of this group is J1862, which is one of the earliest witnesses of this of the Pseudo-Oecumenian tradition. J1862 is a frame catena from the second half of the 10th century, with the commentary on the Acts attributed to Ecumenius, the so-called Commentary Primigenius based on the Catena Andreae on the Catholic Epistles, and Apocalypse with the commentary attributed to Arethas of Caesarea. Overall, J1862 diverges significantly from J1923, the main text, by omitting all the Scholia Fuctiana, 76 extravagantes, and 491 of the original set of number scholia of the normal typus. A close examination of the text passage has also revealed how the compiler of this catena type has been readapted the text of the source by shortening scholia, rearranging the sequence of the extracts, and combining multiple extracts, or on the other side, splitting a single scholia from J1923 into 2 parts with additional material from other sources. The example in this slide are representative of these editorial strategies that I found in the manuscript of the Abridged version, and in particular in J1862. In the first extract, for example, if we compare the text of J1862, which is the second one, we see that J1862 only retain a part of the text as in J1923. So the first sentence, Amartia Fazilega inton diabolon actes, and the second one, actes oekias energias. The other typology of editorial changing is the inversion of the order of the sentences as in J1923, but also we can have paraphrases or rephrased version. So the version offered in J1862 is an abbreviated version compared to the one in J1923, probably because the compiler wanted to stress, to preserve the core meaning of the original text for the sake of the brevity. But on the other hand, while preserving an abbreviated recensio of the catena, J1862 also transmits substantial exegetical material that falls outside the standard text of the Pseudo-Oecumenian tradition. These interpolations have been identified as extracts from the homilies of John Chrysostom and the commentaries on Romans by Theodoret of Syrus. Typically recorded anonymously, these additions are embedded within the number scholia, probably because of the similar topic between the 2 sources, so between the Catena tradition and the direct tradition. So this is the case, for example, in the scholium 798 on Romans, in which J1862 presents the same editorial strategy which I discussed before. So omission of exegetical material, inversion of the order of the sentences compared to J1923, but also the presence of additional exegetical text, which I found as a verbatim reproduction from the Homily 26 from John Chrysostom, which is included within the text of the scholium and not recorded as a separate extract. And this is a particular feature of J1862, not only with Chrysostom, but also with Theodoret. So the comparative analysis of this text passage across the manuscript edition has led to the identification of a potential new witness of this abridged version, the first layer of exegetical material in the manuscript Parisinus Grecus 216, Gregorialan 605. This 10th century manuscript, previously misclassified by Pauline as a representative of the Erweiterte typus, stands as a paradigmatic example of a multi-layered catena featuring the stratification of two or more rows of comments drawn from different catena traditions or collections of homilies. As Alessa Alessandra Letta has noted, 3 distinct scribal hands can be distinguished in the manuscript, each corresponding to a different textual layer. The first hand, framed in orange in the slide, in charge of copying the biblical text and the marginal scholia in an archaic minuscule that Maria Luisa Gatti defines as a geometric type with some affinity with the Pirtea, has been attributed to the clerk Stephanus, Arethas Copis, and already known from his work in the Vaticanus Grecus 1453, a 10th century manuscript with a commentary on Ptolemaeus and Proclus. A preliminary analysis of the whole set of scholia from the end of Stephanos in the manuscript J605 indicates that it transmits the core material from the normal typus, but in the same recension as the abridged version, though with additional excerpts from John Chrysostom, Theodorum of Suesta, and Gregor of Nazianzus, sources not found in J1862 and the manuscripts of the abridged version. Furthermore, the other 2 hands that operate in the manuscript alongside with Stephanov hands have been identified, no, they have not been identified, but they transmit based on a text passage which is the first chapter of Romans. They transmit extracts from the Pseudo-Oecumenian Catena, John of Chrysostom homilies, Theodoret's commentary in the Romans, and is the end framed in blue, and which I wrote some of the marginal scholia in a more cursive hand. While hand C, which is the one framed in green and wrote some of the scholia in a small majuscule Alexandria script, wrote extracts from John Chrysostom, Theodoret, excerpts from Photius, Amphilochia, and Epistolae, and identified scholia which echoes a bit the scholia Photiana. This is a thing that we have to remember for the end of the presentation. So the parallel study of J605 and J1862 has confirmed, as previously indicated, that the first layer of exegetical material presents the same editorial strategies as J1862. So a rearrangement of the scholar sequence compared to the base text, J1923. A shortened version of the Catena text, inversion in sentence order, the reuse of material from previous or subsequent scholia. For example, in this case, we have in bold part of the text from scholium 35 in J1923, which has been reused in scholia 36 to 37 in J1862. Paraphrased renderings, but also insertion of additional material, which either comprise the repetition of the biblical lemmata, which is a particular feature of J1862, so to J605 to have the biblical lemmata repeated at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end of the scholia, but also additional material from other exegetical sources, which include, of course, obviously, always John Chrysostom and the letter repeated from John of Damascus and the commentary of Theodoret on Romans. Scholium 813 in the slide offers a paradigmatical example of the redactional feature outlined before. Here, both the manuscript J1862 J605 seem to combine a part of the text as attested in J1923, which is the section in bold, which itself to represent a revised version of John of Damascus, so Oriente Palaia Omedizantes, Caibrizantes pater, Oigar epite palaias meretantes autonon in from the direct tradition, but at the same time, they also integrate recitation with the rest of the text reproduced verbatim from John of Damascus, suggesting that the compiler was likely aware of the patristic reference. However, despite the evident similarities between the first layer of J605 and the abridged version group, several notable differences emerge from the comparative analysis. Most significantly, 97 scholia found in J1862 are absent from J605. Conversely, J605 includes 38 scholia that appear in J1923 but are not attested in J1862. These extracts are either reproduced almost literally, abbreviated by retaining only part of the text as in J1923, or expanded with additional unidentified material. Among the scholia shared with J1923 and J1862, there are instances in which J605 aligns more closely with J1923 than with J1862. For example, J1862 includes the additional content from the normal typus in orange for example, J1862 preserves only part of the scholium 828 compared to J1923, while J605 integrated the text from J1923. Finally, several anonymous scholia absent from J1862 have been identified as extracts from Chrysostomomilis, Gregory of Nazianzum in Sanctum Baptisma, and primarily fragments from Theodore of Suestia Lost Commentary on Romans. These fragments from the Lost Commentary of Theodore of Suestia on Romans have been preserved only in the catena of Typus Vaticanus, so the Vaticanus Grecus 762, Gregoriana 1915, the Typus Monacensis, Monacensis Theologicus Grecus 142, J1909, and the TP Unici, Vindobonensis Theologicus Grecus 166, which is GA 1953, and Beatus Patrocatoros 28, or Gregoriana 1900 for Romans, of course. So this will position J605 as another representative of this fragmented text. Given that most of the anonymous extracts absent from the Pseudo-Oecumenian tradition in J605 are derived from Theodore's commentary, it is plausible that the unidentified excerpts may be passages from Theodore commentaries unattested in the other Catena traditions. But what is the connection, and I'm going to conclude the last part of my presentation, what is the connection between the abridged version J605 and the Arethas of Caesarea? According to Pirtea, and I quote, there is a distinct possibility that Arethas knew or even owed the manuscript, J605, since the scribe of J605 is the same Stephanos who copied the famous Euclid manuscript Oxford Bodleian Library 301 for Arethas' library in 888. End of quote. Highly educated in classical and early Christian literature, Arethas was a prominent figure in the Byzantine ecclesiastical world from the 9th century, as well as an active bibliophile who, according to Fonkic, owned and commissioned 8 manuscripts, including the Dorgan manuscript copied by Stephanos. He is best known for his commentary on the Revelation, preserved both in shorter and longer recension. Additionally, marginally attributed to Arethas of Caesarea have been identified in 2 manuscripts from Stab's expanded type, J617, J1998, within the Pseudo-Oecumenian Catena. So, based on an investigation of the paratextual material in early 10th century manuscripts of the Apocalypse, Pirtea has argued that, and I quote, Arethas proposed and carried out an editorial project aimed at bringing the presentation of the Apocalypse in line with the rest of the New Testament, end of quote. In support of his thesis, he highlights the significance of GA 314, a 10th century manuscript witnesses the abridged version for the Pauline Epistles, as a key example to illustrate how the paratextual material in the manuscript perfectly reflects Arethas' editorial plan to create a full corpus of New Testament writings with accompanying commentaries. According to Pirtea, GA 314 set the trend for the integration of the Apocalypse commentaries into New Testament Catena manuscripts from the 11th century onward. It is perhaps not a coincidence that all the manuscripts mentioned by Pirtea as representatives of this trend belong to the abridged version group, and combined an abbreviated version of Andrew's commentary on the Apocalypse with an abbreviated version of the Catena on Paul to create a more manageable and accessible version of the New Testament corpus to the audience. In addition to the textual parallels, the idea that these manuscripts from the Abridged version group are the product of a coordinated editorial endeavor or a scriptorium is further supported by the striking similarities in layout and catena organization. With the exception of J2125, all the manuscripts of the Abridged version group are frame catena dated to the 10th and 11th century, each decorated with a pile enclosing the head of each of the epistles. Another particular distinctive feature shared by this group of manuscripts is the numbering system of the scholia, which instead of continuing progressively across the codex, starts afresh on each page. And this is a typical feature of only this group of manuscripts. Furthermore, this group also shares the same abbreviated form of the Italian apparatus, including the prologue, the Peregrinationes Pauli, the Italian preface to the Romans, and the list of the Catalagia. But for example, the martyrdom of Paul is absent. Notably, the internal contents of these manuscripts also align. They consistently comprise the Praxapostolos and the Revelation, along with corresponding abbreviated catena and commentaries. The Oecumenian Catena on the Acts, which is likely an epitomized version of the Catena Andreae, the abridged version of the Pauline Epistles, and the abbreviated commentary of Andrew of Caesarea on the Apocalypse. So to conclude, this presentation has offered some preliminary observations regarding a previously unclassified or misclassified subtype within the Pseudo-Oecumenian Catena tradition, with particular attention to its relationship with J605 and the scriptorium of Arethas of Caesarea. While these findings are provisional and must ultimately be verified through a critical revision of the Catena, some possible conclusions can be drawn. First, regarding the type of text transmitted by J1862, it is difficult to determine with absolute certainty whether it represents an early recensio subsequently developed into the normal typus, or rather a secondary epitomized version of the catena. This uncertainty is due in part to the nature of this type of catena, which predominantly transmits the number set of scholia or the extravagantes for which no direct tradition is attested. Nonetheless, several features appear to support the hypothesis that J1862 reflects a secondary stage of reduction. The inclusion of a Photianum commenting on Romans 1:18, the incorporation of additional material from Chrysostom or Theodoret within the scholia of the Pseudo-Oecumenian Catena, and the overall tendency to quote less verbatim than quote the direct tradition when attested. Regarding J605 and the Abridged version manuscripts, it is without any doubt that the first set of scholia share a significant number of features with the Abridged version, while also preserving extensive excerpts from Theodorus of Suecia and John Chrysostom that fall outside the standard text of the Pseudo-Oecumenian Catena. My conclusion is that J605 represents a typus unicus that combines different catena traditions and commentaries to produce a hybrid catena similar to Panella's definition of complex Constantinopolitan catena tradition. Finally, the possibility that J605 was produced within the scriptorium of Arethas of Caesarea was first proposed by Electra, who identified Stephanos in the manuscript, and then developed by Pirtea, who suggested that the J314 represents the beginning of an editorial plan of Arethas himself aimed at standardizing the presentation of the New Testament corpus. Aletta has further identified the NC of J605, the Alp majuscule script, as the same scribe responsible for the first fourth folio in the manuscript Deauville 31, which is the second slide, the second picture in the last slide. Paleographically, I think that this end matches the one found at the end of the manuscript with the subscription stating that the manuscript was copied from Stephanos under the commission of Arethas of Caesarea. And this subscription, according to Fontich, is by Arethas of Caesarea himself. Moreover, Moreover, just the last question. Moreover, NC is responsible for recording extracts from Photius, Epistles, and Finocchia, as well as several identified scholia that exhibit some parallel with the scholia Photiana. This is particularly relevant in light of Nigel Wilson's suggestion that Arethas himself may have composed the marginal notice on the Photian text. Therefore, if you accept that both Arethas and Stephanos collaborated in J605, it became plausible to argue that the abbreviated version of the exegesis on Romans transmitted in this manuscript was developed as part of Arethas' broader editorial project, namely the creation of a full set of New Testament texts with commentaries in a more manageable format. A closer investigation of the scholia attributed to Arethas in the two manuscripts of the expanded type may further clarify this connection and determine whether the so-called abridged version reflects a deliberate stage in the evolution of the Pseudo-Oecumenian Catena under Arethas' supervision. Thank you for the attention.
Just a very short question. Any question ready?
All questions are fine. An example of what actually continue.
So thank you so much for your answer. Is Clark Bay, who is a professor of New Testament at Forge Theological Seminary and at the Istituto di Formazione Evangelica e Documentazione in Padova. And his paper is entitled New Testament Catena as Retranslations of Paul, a Philological Assessment.
So if I read the schedule right, I actually have an hour and a half. So I